not the fear, not the scare, not the all the negative uh, sentiments that are attached to the word governance, and if were we to miss doing what is needed around governance and the consequences that may follow. So this is not to talk about any of those. This is more about simply put, uh, keeping our house in order. Like, it's a governance is more like housekeeping and being a great home manager versus anything else. Like, what should sit ideally in my kitchen, if it were to travel to my bedroom, that would not be good housekeeping. Essentially, governance is a lot like that, as to how do I keep my house in order, how do I do what I need to do vis-a-vis my business, at one end of which is sales, marketing, business expansion, revenue generation, but at the other end is also about keeping that entire infrastructure on which all of those functions run, which is your HR compliances, your registrations as an organization, your standard form contracts. So there's a lot of foundations and fundamentals on which the external functions and components of an organization are built. Like I just said about sales, marketing, business development, expansion. So, this is more about how do I keep my infrastructure robust and strong. And that's how I look at governance. And that's what I learned in my journey as a lawyer this far about governance. So I know, I think I have perhaps, Aditi, oversimplified it or broadened the base of the introduction, but let me just jump into the first question, which is right there on your slide. What on earth is corporate governance? And what do you mean by it? What do you see and what do you advise your clients about it?
Right. Corporate governance is a set of decisions, policies, and essentially a framework which governs the internal dealings of a company as well as external dealings. It is not limited only to a broad like code of conduct which the company or the employees, or for that matter any of the founders, the promoters, that they need to follow. It is also important from an external perspective, external dealings with suppliers, vendors, customers, depending on the nature of services the startup provides. Corporate governance essentially is a structure that specifies the distribution of the rights and responsibilities among the different participants in a company. The principles that the corporate governance, I would say, is based upon is integrity and fairness. While I speak about integrity and fairness, it essentially means being just and equal under all scenarios, which essentially would mean that an organization, which where all its stakeholders, such as employees, suppliers, distributors, public relations, consumers, are treated equally without any limitations. It not only helps in creating brand value, it also helps. It creates an brand value as well as creating a positive image outside in with the people you are dealing with. The next one being transparency and disclosure, which I feel again is very important. Definitely, there are certain mandatory disclosures which are required to be done under law. However, disclosing relevant details to third parties, having a transparent relationship internally and externally definitely aids in the growth of the business. It is important that the interplay between the board and the shareholders is based on trust. The third one, which is very critical, which is accountability. I would take accountability and responsibility as one, and explain the distinction between the two. Accountability is essentially where a person is, accountable to do a particular task given in an organization. However, the responsibility pursuant to the act done, it may not be with the person who performed it. So therefore, there is a distinction between accountability and responsibility. They do go hand in hand, but there is a thin line of difference wherein certain accountabilities are set within the organization, within different people of an organization. However, the responsibility vests with a certain number of people, the core team probably in an organization. So these four principles is what sets is what on which the rules and the code of the corporate governance of an entity should be based upon. Um, Yes, like you mentioned that it's good to have the house in order. So one of the important aspects that corporate governance covers is having the house in order.
Got it. No, thanks, Aditi. That's helpful. I just wanted to touch upon two pieces of information that you shared with us. One was that you did mention in one of your conversations that governance is also about your dealings and contracts with vendors and contractors. Now, how is that relevant, or how is that critical to a governance standard? And I just want to add and connect it to your last point, one of the principles of governance that you spoke about, in the context of accountability and responsibility. So if you could explain why is vendors and contractors and contracts or conversations with them critical to governance, and how would you connect it to accountability and responsibility?
Right. So Shruti, like we have these service contracts with our vendors, with our customers. Then in an agreement, we do set out what would the scope of services. The scope of services that that company A needs to perform, and there are certain parameters under which those services need to be performed, right? And the people performing those services may be the people who are right at the job doing that, providing those services. Whereas you'll have these clauses wherein a company becomes liable for any acts that is for any non-compliance or breach of contract, breach of the provisions of that agreement with that supplier or customer. So here we see that the person who may be performing the job is different. However, the liability would fall on the company. So it is very critical to ensure that the service agreements that we enter into, we specifically articulate what we are committing to perform, the standards that we would be adhering to, and the timelines, etc. So that these agreements need to be specifically set out from that perspective.
So, for example, if I were the sales head of our organization, so to speak, and I went out to negotiate a sales contract and I overcommitted. So, supposing I said that I'm the best intellectual property lawyer, or we have very, very deep expertise in intellectual property law, that's and somebody contracted with me on that basis with the firm actually, and I failed to deliver on that, then that would technically be, I was accountable for that and I kind of delivered on that. Uh, but I made the organization in violation of what our commitment of standards and quality of service, etc. are. And when we fail to deliver on that, say for example, then the firm bears the cost, and the cost on the firm could be reputational. The cost on the firm could be also monetary if were we to get penalized for having misrepresented. That's perhaps what you were saying. Yeah,
Absolutely.
got it. That's helpful. That's helpful. Great. So yes, that was going to be my next question as to why and what are the key areas I mean, why do we need that? I mean, we know a little bit of the why, but perhaps the why will get more pronounced as you perhaps helpfully take us through this slide on what are the key areas where corporate governance must be kept an eye on. So if you could just enlighten us with some whatever you have to share with us on this slide.
Right. So it's very important to have a common code of conduct. Essentially, that each of the employees and each of the members of a particular organization resonate to. So there has to be some sort of common code of conduct that binds all, and a particular way of dealing and performing the tasks that they are supposed to be doing. It obviously it's to ensure that there is no misuse of funds, company funds. Proper checks and balances are kept in place to ensure that there is no misutilization of the funds of or misappropriation of the funds of the company. It also is important because there's a requirement of transparency between the between the people who are running the show. For example, the key managerial personnel, the promoters, as well as the directors on the board, vis-a-vis the stakeholders. It's very critical to have that kind of transparency, and the shareholders are aware of what's happening in the company. The third being the protecting data and privacy, which I believe is one of the critical aspects, given that we're dealing with data of personal sensitive information or personal information in the dealings of our in the ordinary course of business, essentially, while we're providing the services. So protection of data and privacy also is a key aspect of corporate governance. Avoiding future risks, in the event the company is required, reaches out to third parties, external parties, for any sort of funding, any sort of investment. It's important that the house is kept in order. The requirements that the compliances that are required to be undertaken are carried out in a timely manner and as per applicable law. Necessary registrations, licenses are taken for conducting the business of the company, that are basically applicable to the company. All of those are in place to avoid any sort of future liability or any future risk that a company could foresee.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts here, Aditi. Essentially, this common code of conduct sounds like a very heavy duty document and, complex. And I'm a young company, I'm all of two founders and a few mavericks who believed in what we think. Say, for example, I mean, how am I meant to be, and why is it relevant for a small organization like mine? And how complex is this document? I really don't have the money to pay any lawyer, forget even think of having one. So, how do I go about this devising a code of conduct? It sounds like a very heavy duty document. Or could it be a simple, just basic norms and rules of how we work together with each other? What is it?
Right. So it could be a basic norm, a simpliciter document which sets out the principles the principles and I would say the values that a company is based on, and it need not be a heavy document of sorts. And also, I would like to move on to my next slide, which essentially covers this, which is
Got it.
corporate governance is omnipresent, right? So there is at each aspect, I would say each sphere in the dealings of a company, it is important that a transparency is maintained, regular compliances are undertaken, whatever is required to be done to protect the interest of the company or the stakeholders of the company, are those actions are taken in a timely manner. And
Got
yes,
it. Got it. If you could go back to the next previous slide, because I did have a few questions on that one again for you.
right.
Sorry, I'm not going to let you go easy today.
Mhm.
So you said something about avoiding future risks.
Right.
How is that? I mean, how can good corporate governance and, okay, I understand transparency, we need to have, great, in a young organization like a startup, you definitely need to have each critical stakeholder, however few or however more, to have complete understanding and knowledge of which stakeholder has what accountability for the business, for the firm, for the ideation and the innovation. So all of, and therefore, how are they aligning the available funds to that, so that there's one thing is misuse, like you said. One thing it also could be about how can that
Be judiciously
affect
used.
the,
Yeah,
how's that disbursed, sorry.
right.
And therefore, but how is it about future risks is where I'm thinking as to how can that happen.
So, while we were dealing with one of our clients, essentially, where we saw that there was the company's trademark was infringed. Like we had come across that, and the company had become aware of the trademark being infringed. Then the necessary suit that needs to be filed for trademark infringement ought to be carried out. One cannot be laxed about such things as IPR. In the IPR of the company for a startup, it's very critical. So it's important to take the right action at the right time and evaluate it against the funds that are being dispersed in respect of undertaking that action. Since IPR is so critical, right? It would become a huge risk at a later stage in case there is any issue with the trademark that the company has been using for years. So it's very important to take the necessary action at the right time to avoid the future risk.
Got it. And I think I can see a question there about, how do we draw a line between data privacy and transparency? And if you'll allow me, I'll take that one for us. Essentially, it's before we get to drawing a line, Ram, it's more about understanding what kind of data am I collecting, what obligations emerge from that data. Now, amongst the key stakeholders that I have, you're right that how much should each person within that key stakeholder community know about each and every portion of the data. And where that will all emerge from is this entire framework of consent that we are looking at in the new legislation that is going to come by very shortly. So essentially, it's all a function of awareness, where at an organization level, it is very critical for us to know what kind of data we are collecting and whose data are we collecting, and do we have the right consents and permissions in place. And then, basis the right consents and permissions, how are we processing it? And processing it means how are we using it for providing the services that we are required to provide on the basis of that. And that also then includes, are we using it and keeping it for the time period that it's necessary for us to use it and keep it? Which form are we keeping it? Are we pseudonymizing it? Are we anonymizing it? And then once our purposes of that data are done, how much are we retaining it or destroying it? Again, each of those pieces, please know, will be governed by whose data. If it's personal data, whose data am I processing or using? And if it's non-personal data, then of course there are certain regulations around that are also coming by. So essentially, awareness of what am I collecting and for what purpose, that's where the journey begins. And and the basis of, if it's personal data, the consent framework that I have and the consent architecture that I have will manage the transparency aspects of your question. I hope I have answered your question, and we can happily take that forward, even later as if you'd like. So yeah, Aditi, I thought I'd quickly answer that question on the slide as before we move forward. Yeah.
Right.
So over to you for this slide. It seems like it is omnipresent.
Yes, like we were discussing that this is relevant. Corporate governance is relevant in every sphere. For example, it is very critical to ensure that the contracts the material agreements of the company are in order. Necessary stamp duty has been paid. It has been duly negotiated in the interest of the company. Um, uh, a lot of times we see that. The you know in the ordinary course of business, companies, smaller companies end up doing providing services on basis of an invoice, and not laying out the terms and conditions in further minute details, which I believe may become an issue. Um, so it's very important to have the house in order in terms of having your material agreements with each of your vendors, suppliers, even employees for that matter, in place. The next critical aspect that I would want to pick up is financing and borrowing. In the event the company has taken any sort of loan, having the sanction letter, the necessary facility agreements in place, the company, like the promoters who are negotiating on behalf of the company, should know exactly what they are signing up for, and what kind of security is being given in terms of in these facility documents, as well as the kind of negative covenants that a facility agreement includes, essentially. So one should be well aware of the kind of agreements that are being signed up on behalf of the company. The next one being on regulatory compliances and registration. Like we all see, if a company is in any regulated space, and it would essentially required to take certain permissions, approvals for any actions that it undertakes. And it would probably also require some sort of registration that needs to be taken. I have also seen startups obviously being registered with TPIIT to avail certain benefits. So having all of that in place really makes a difference, and it ensures that it gives a lot of confidence to third parties, I would say, when any external party is dealing with the company. They know that the kind of services that are being provided, they are all under the purview of the regulator, and necessary compliances for the same are being followed by the company. I would also like to touch upon intellectual property, a copyright or a trademark, whatever is relevant to a particular entity, is very important. And at the early stage, it is important to protect such mark, logo, or have the trademark registered, the necessary copyright registrations to be undertaken by the company to protect any sort of infringement of IP at a later stage. The next critical point is the human resource, which is essentially the crux of a company. It's because of the people people of the startup, that the startup it's obviously collective effort. So therefore, people are really important resources, I would say, in an organization. So therefore, obviously, undertaking the necessary compliances under labor laws, having those in place, having executed employment agreements with each of the employees, with so that it's clear as to what an employee also expects, and what his job role would be, is clearly set out, ensuring that any kind of IPR generated while working is also protected, and is for the company and belongs to the company. Like you touched upon, data privacy, it is very, very critical, and it aids each of these sections, because all of the other boxes that I spoke about deal with data, and obviously a company is thriving on data, so it's very important to protect the data. So yes, we see that corporate governance is just everywhere, and it resonates to each of these each of these spheres. um, so I would like to say it's omnipresent.
Got it, Aditi. And I think, there's one question that, how is it relevant to startups? And I know Prakash has been very helpful in asking that question specifically, that, but how is this concerning startups? So as I attempt to answer this for Prakash, if anybody else also has that thought, existing, please know that each of the startups are just younger companies, corporate governance is not just one aspect as we understand it, which is about regulatory licenses and registration, which is a key part of it, which has some severe and serious consequences attached to it. So for example, you can't have an office location without a shops and establishment registration, say for example. Not having it will lead to consequences around it. If you are a manufacturing startup, then obviously you need to have all the compliances under the labor and the employment codes, etc., and the Industrial Disputes Act, and all of that pieces. So while there are consequences, please know that each of these pieces, if you have a young team, for you to have a human resource policy, an employee handbook, or employee contract, not having that could lead to bad governance and consequences that could be attached to the governance piece. Like Aditi talked about, one of our clients, and the need for intellectual property, you should know at what stage, what should you be doing about protecting the intellectual property that your startup has created and invested all your time and effort in. Not protecting that could lead to a governance concern, both internally, because somebody could well ahead go and exploit it, and then also externally, because then the value that your intellectual property could get from potential investors or potential acquirers, so to speak, that would get compromised, and that becomes a governance issue. If you have a material contract and that is not well documented about your rights, obligations, your price, your commercials, etc., and there is a violation or a breach of that contract, your rights are not protected, and that impacts governance. So essentially, this is just to kind of belabor the point. If uh, if we understand the fact that governance is the cornerstone and the bedrock of any organization, and therefore it is omnipresent. So I just wanted to bring that out for you, Prakash. And if that answers your question, and as we go about, we would be talking about some of the specifics. So Aditi, why don't you tell us, a little bit about the organization and who's in charge and who actually delivers on the issues and requirements under corporate governance.
Right. So essentially, how we see is that there is a company and we have our board of directors. The board of directors are required to act in accordance with the articles of association of the company, which essentially sets out the internal the policies that govern a company internally. So a director is required to act in good faith in order to promote the objects of the company, essentially for acting for the benefit of its members, its employees, shareholders, the community, and protection of the environment as a whole. The director is required to act with reasonable care, diligence, and is required to exercise its independent judgment. Obviously, a startup is in a startup, a board of directors play a key role, and the other KMPs also play a key role in performing their duties. Given there are various, like we discussed, that there are various contracts that the company executes. There are various sort of compliances that need to be taken in terms of licenses and registrations. So the role of a director becomes very critical. Essentially. the director is also essentially required to act in good faith and for the benefit of its members. Whereas the shareholders here, the shareholders are also given certain rights under the Companies Act. There are certain resolutions which can only be passed and require shareholder approval. So essentially, then a shareholder also plays an important role. They obviously attend and vote at general meetings. They're entitled to receiving copies of financial statements. They also they can conduct inspections. So there are certain rights which are obviously granted under the Companies Act, but there are also rights which emanate from a shareholders agreement. That is the shareholders agreement of the company, which essentially lays out the inter se rights and obligations of these shareholders. So that's the broad distinction here.
Yeah, Aditi, thanks. And I will just want to kind of elaborate a little onto your point, because I think perhaps the underlying concern that I can see in some of the questions, and Karthi is also asking that. So, Karthi, to your point, some of the specific compliances that a startup must do are coming in the next two slides. We will touch upon the compliances and governance that a startup must absolutely adhere to. But just so to speak, like on the previous slide, I was explaining to Prakash, governance is about more, is across every action that you take, and that's the point. That is the a broader conversation that we want to highlight about governance. And also on this slide that Aditi was talking about, this entire piece about however young a company, there are shareholders in it. Unless you're bootstrapped and there are only the founders funding it, if there is an angel investor, or you have external seed investment, or you have institutional investors, there is a bunch of governance requirements that emanate out of the shareholders agreement, like Aditi mentioned, where you are obligated to keep your shareholders or your board of directors, however informal or formal that structure may be, about the key actions, about expansion of the company, actions about employing people, and actions about how are you utilizing the funds to further the intent on which the investments were brought. And all of this forms part of a company, as young as it may be or as old as it may be. So I just wanted to bring that about. And then Aditi, I think the request to you would be that if you will really help us with the next two slides, this one and the next one both, please, if you could take us through in detail about each one of these, and that will really help us understand what we at least make the world of governance real as we understand it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Right. So what I would like to add here is, I mean, before I begin, certain compliances need to be undertaken by companies from which these compliances emanate from the Companies Act 2013 and the rules made thereunder. There could be there are certain compliances which are ongoing, which are regular compliances and need to be annually undertaken by the company. There are certain event-based compliances which are basically which happen on occurring of a particular event. For example, if there is a issuance, if there is an investment in the company and the investment is through a private placement, so necessary resolutions need to be passed. A board resolution needs to be passed. It also needs to be approved by a shareholders resolution. Then it requires a person to issue the company to issue a private placement offer, followed by the allotment, as well as receiving of money allotment, followed by making a filing with the ROC in the form of PAS 3. So there are certain event place filings which get triggered on happening of an event, which could be say, for example, issuance of shares. It could be taking of loan, creating of charge, branch. So these are compliances which happen, say for example, appointment of a director, one needs to file DIR 12 with the ROC. So there are a few filings and compliances that need to be undertaken on happening of a certain event, whereas the other sort of compliances which include are the annual compliances, for example the AOC 4 and the filing of the MGT 7. They are all annual filings which need to be done on a yearly basis. And then a company also needs to maintain registers such as the register of directors, members, register of share transfers, register of loans, guarantees, securities, etc. So there are certain compliances which go which are in the nature of an ongoing compliance, whereas certain compliances are event based. Also having all your essentially your regularly conducting board meetings. There cannot be a gap of more than 120 days between two board meetings. Entity needs to obviously it needs to do 4 board meetings in a year. So there are various compliances that need to be followed by the company at all times. So that's what I wanted to stress upon. We do assist a lot of our clients on all of these. We do help them on a regular basis by undertaking all these compliances for them. So it's very important to ensure that an entity is compliant from this aspect from the very beginning. If it proposes to reach out to external third parties for any sort of investment, or in any sort of external dealings. So Ashwati, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry. And one of the key ways in which we assist, just to add to what Aditi was saying, is in creating a very comprehensive and a robust event-based and an ongoing compliance calendar, so that nothing that is critical to an organization is missed. And there are reminders and alarms that kind of advise you or guide you as to what you need to do and at what time or at the happening of which event. So just wanted to add that, Aditi. I think this slide and the next one both are very, very critical for you to be explained. Yeah.
Right. So weakens, like it's set out on the slide, weakens the investor confidence, more bargaining power of the investor, risk of investor backing out from the deal once a due diligence is done. So these are a few, I would say the few pointers in case the company is non-compliant. From a startup perspective, it weakens the negotiating power and impacts the value of shares. Moving on, there are various licenses and registrations that need to be undertaken. We've picked up the key mandatory licenses and registrations in this slide. Essentially, having registration with the under the Shops and Establishment Act, in Central Goods and Services Tax, in the event the aggregate turnover exceeds the amount. Income Tax Act, EPF, if there are more than 20 employees, and Employee State Insurance Act, payment of gratuity, and Sexual Harassment Act, which are very critical, and these are regular compliances that need to be taken. There are certain exemptions that are given in the event a startup is DPIIT registered. So one needs to know what applies to its organization, and needs to ensure that he or she has obtained the license for their entity.
Great. So anything, I think what you've done is you've covered the essential ones and the mandatory ones that each organization must have. And obviously some of them have a threshold to it, and by which, they will need to kind of get to it. I think in addition to this, there would be sector specific and industry specific licenses and registrations. Some could be one time, some could be renewable, and some of those things need to be kind of kept in mind as you're establishing your organization. It also will be relevant to know which state, which region are you setting it up, and if there are any state specific aspects to be looked at for you to be able to have the basic governance set up for you to be able to function in that region or state. So I just wanted to add that, Aditi, to your.
Absolutely.
Yes, here comes the challenges. What do we, what a young organization or even an old organization both have in common is how we handle that. So it'd be great if you could speak a little about the challenges to what we need to do.
Yes. So the first thing Shruti, which I notice is the challenge is about the awareness of the compliance and the importance of the compliance. It may be that one is aware that a compliance needs to be undertaken, but not conscious of the importance of such a compliance, or the risk that it would carry if it were not undertaken. So awareness and the importance of a particular compliance, how important it may be critical, it may not be critical, depends on the space that a startup is in. So from that perspective, one needs to know what applies to the entity. So awareness and importance would be the first one that I would want to state. The second being investing in the expert advisors and mentors. So having the right kind of mentors, say even from a cap table perspective, it is very important that the right one reaches out to the right expert, the right set of mentors, the expert advisors who are able to help do these filings. These filings require certain amount of assessment, I would say, a review and an assessment, and reaching out to the right to an expert advisor is very critical. The third one being communication and corresponding actions. It is very important that the founders who hold the company, essentially who get together all the pieces of the company, they communicate among between each other, and they know their roles and responsibilities within the entity, right? So communication, effective communication is very, very important, because one may take up one aspect, and if two people are looking at the same aspect, it may be so that a second aspect is missed. So a holistic view and effective communication would help overcome the third challenge.
Great. No, there's another question that's come up. How do founders become upfront aware of ensuing compliances when the same is not shared by expert consultant? I would just say, Ram, hire the right consultants and advisors. But, so simply, that's perhaps on a lighter note. But yes, it also depends on, so I remember this experience of mine as I've spent a lot of time being in-house to a company, and obviously they were larger corporations, but one of the lessons I learned is that my advisors as good as I make them. So one of the skills that I needed to hone for myself, despite the fact that I was a lawyer and I was looking at my external advisors to help me with my issues for the company, etc., was, am I asking the right questions, and am I giving them all the information necessary for them to be able to give me the right advice and guidance? So it's, while I was joking about it, that it's not to take away anything from the advisory community out there, but it is really about choosing the right expert for what your problem area or your question or your issue is, and also then equipping him or her with all the information that is required and needed for the person to be able to answer that question for you, and also then asking the right questions as to, okay, because you remember your consultant or advisor doesn't know the company as well as you do, and doesn't know the future that you are creating for the company as you do. So, just like to Aditi's point on communication and, giving all the data and information available, and then choosing, and like going back to the first example, supposing you were to come, you had a query on technology, given you maybe a technology startup, you need to look at your advisor, who you're going to for that advice. You need to weigh and measure that advisor's, uh, if it's a chartered accountant, then he would be an expert at finance, so that may not be the right advisor to go for technology. And I'm simplifying, I'm oversimplifying the example, but that's just to bring about my point that if you needed technology advice, you would go to perhaps one of the best in the industry who know technology, a CIO or a CTO or somebody of that caliber who would know and understand your problem area with. So that's, I hope it's a longer answer, but it's getting the right advice is a two-way street, and that's what makes it comprehensive and good. So Ram, I hope I've answered that question for you. Any other questions?
Yes, we request our participants to please ask the questions because we are almost about time. And in case you would like to further think through or deliberate with your colleagues after the session, you can also write your queries to us. We'll be happy to route to KLA team. I'll be mentioning my email address where you can route your queries.
Great. I think, Deepak, this has been a good session. We've taken back a few learnings as to how do we kind of communicate governance, specific governance before we get into generic governance. And that's some learning we're taking back, especially when we're talking to younger organizations. In that context, if there are any unanswered queries, like Deepak said, we'll be more than happy to take them up and give you all the specific answers that you may need on any compliance or governance questions that you may have. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Aditi. Thank you all.